The United Nations was founded on a promise to end the scourge of war. Since 1948, the iconic blue helmets have been the embodiment of that promise. Soldiers sent into the world's worst conflicts to keep the peace. But the reality is that the UN's ambition often clashes disastrously with its execution. Across the decades, from the jungles of the Congo to the killing fields of the Balkans, UN missions have been paralyzed by bureaucratic hesitation, timid political mandates, and a profound lack of will from its most powerful members. The tragic result is a recurring pattern. Brave peacekeepers are functionally abandoned by their own command structures, and the vulnerable civilians they swore to protect are left defenseless against atrocity. This is the story of those failures, of the systemic errors and critical choices that turned missions into devastating cautionary tales. This is how the organization built to save the world has repeatedly shafted its own people and its most sacred principles. We begin in the Congo, 1961, with a handful of Irish soldiers who were ordered to hold the line, then left to die. The Siege of Jadotville. The year is 1961. The Republic of Congo, newly independent from Belgium, is fracturing. The mineral-rich province of Katanga has seceded, threatening a wider civil war. To stabilize the region, the UN deploys its ONUC mission, which includes a small company of 155 Irish peacekeepers stationed in the mining town of Jadotville. These men, commanded by Commandant Pat Quinlan, were lightly armed and operating under a standard Chapter 6 peacekeeping mandate, meaning they were there to observe and patrol, not to engage in combat. But on September 13th, the rug was pulled out from under them. UN headquarters, without informing the Irish, had launched a major military operation, Operation Mordor, elsewhere in Katanga to seize key installations. This unilateral action triggered a swift, ferocious retaliation from the secessionist forces and their mercenaries, who immediately encircled the isolated Irish contingent at Jadotville. The Irish were besieged, caught completely off guard by an enemy force estimated to be thousands strong. For 5 relentless days, A Company fought with astonishing courage, inflicting devastating losses on their attackers, all while enduring intense mortar, machine gun, and rifle fire. But the fight was a desperate one. Their appeals to UN command for relief were met with a tragic combination of poor coordination and stunning incompetence. Attempts to send ground convoys were easily repulsed. An emergency resupply by a single helicopter proved disastrous, delivering only contaminated water. With every request for air or ground support either denied, delayed, or bungled, the peacekeepers watched as their vital supplies of water and ammunition dwindled to nothing. Abandoned and completely isolated, Commandant Quinlan had no choice but to surrender after 5 days of combat, a decision made to save the lives of his men who, remarkably, suffered 0 fatalities. For decades afterward, the political fallout led the UN and even the Irish military to downplay the incident, effectively scapegoating the soldiers and dismissing their heroic stand as an embarrassment, leaving the men feeling like they'd been hung out to dry. The blue helmets in the Congo were victims of UN incompetence, but 6 years later, another UN force would be a victim of the very principle of peacekeeping itself. The crisis in the Sinai Peninsula would prove the existential weakness of the UN's original philosophy. The year is 1967 and the world is on edge. For over a decade, the United Nations Emergency Force, UNEF, had been the thin blue line holding a fragile peace between Egypt and Israel in the volatile Sinai Peninsula. Deployed after the 1956 Suez Crisis, these peacekeepers were a crucial triumph of international diplomacy, successfully separating two fierce adversaries simply by their presence. Their mandate, however, carried a built-in vulnerability that would prove to be the mission's fatal flaw. UNEF was a consent-based mission, meaning it operated entirely at the pleasure of the host state of Egypt. This dependency ensured that the peace was always conditional. As regional tensions escalated dramatically in May 1967, Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser began a series of provocative military moves. He remilitarized the Sinai and, crucially, demanded that the UN Secretary-General, U Thant, immediately and totally withdraw the entire UNEF force. Nasser sought to clear the battlefield and prepare his military for confrontation with Israel, knowing the UN's presence was the only thing stopping him. As a result, U Thant believed that without Egypt's consent, the mission had no legal basis to remain. To defy the host state risked placing peacekeepers into an active combat zone against Egyptian will, potentially leading to mass casualties and shattering the core principle of cooperative peacekeeping. Yet, complying meant surrendering the world's only chance for de-escalation. In a decision that shocked and dismayed international observers, U Thant chose the path of rapid compliance. In just 48 hours, orders were issued for the complete withdrawal of the UNEF force. In the ensuing weeks, the crisis spiraled out of control. When the Six-Day War erupted on June 5th, the absence of the UNEF force was universally cited as a crucial factor that allowed the massive region-defining conflict to ignite, permanently altering the geopolitical map of the Middle East and leading to decades of instability. But if UN peace could be destroyed by political consent, it could also be rendered irrelevant by military might. Since 1964, the United Nations peacekeeping force in Cyprus had been on the island, primarily tasked with monitoring the fragile ceasefire between the Greek Cypriot and Turkish Cypriot communities. The force was lightly armed and structured under a standard Chapter 6 mandate, which was appropriate for quelling communal tensions and observing separation. It was designed to manage a contained dispute, but it was absolutely not prepared, funded, or authorized to face an interstate war between NATO allies. The fragile peace shattered in July 1974. A Greek-backed military coup on the island prompted a massive retaliatory Turkish invasion. Suddenly, the lightly armed UN contingent found itself sandwiched between two modern militaries, complete with tanks, naval operations, and air support. The peacekeepers' limited rules of engagement and their minimal firepower instantly rendered their mission meaningless. They were still mandated to keep peace between neighbors, but they were now surrounded by a war waged by nation-states. In the face of overwhelming force, the UN peacekeepers' posts were abandoned under fire, communication lines were cut, and their ability to protect the civilian populace vanished as the fighting raged. Turkish forces advanced rapidly, slicing through the island. In the ensuing chaos, the UN could do little but retreat to secure compounds and act as passive spectators to the island's division, able only to shelter a few thousands of civilians who made it to their gates. The resulting division of Cyprus remains a scar on the island to this day. The tragic missions involving the United Nations Interim Force in Lebanon demonstrated how a peacekeeping mandate, meant to shield the innocent, can instead leave peacekeepers paralyzed and vulnerable to calculated aggression. The UN was deployed in 1978 to monitor the withdrawal of Israeli forces from southern Lebanon. It was a classic interim force mission where peacekeepers were placed in a high-stakes zone where the primary opponent was the Israeli-backed local militia, the South Lebanon Army, or the SLA. The peacekeepers operated under rigid, cautious rules of engagement that ensured they would prioritize diplomacy over immediate, decisive action. This paralyzing caution was put to the ultimate test in the week-long standoff known as the Battle of Artillery in April 1980. SLA forces, seeking to establish permanent control, launched a heavy assault using armored vehicles, trapping the Irish contingent. Though the Irish command rejected the SLA's demands in line with UN policy, the UN leadership dangerously delayed authorization to use force. This political hesitation forced peacekeepers to endure a sustained period of intense, hostile fire, escalating the risk to the point of tragedy, including the death of Private Stephen Griffin. The defense of Artillery finally became a watershed moment. After suffering casualties, the UN force commander ultimately gave the unprecedented order to engage aggressively, allowing the Irish and Dutch contingents to return fire and eventually clear the village. This military action was later vindicated by UN Security Council Resolution 467, which affirmed UNIFIL's right to self-defense. Yet, the mission's credibility was shattered by another failure just 6 days later. On April 18th, a small UNIFIL resupply party set out for a remote post. Despite the recent combat and obvious dangers, the convoy proceeded. The party was intercepted and seized by the SLA. Two of the peacekeepers, Privates Thomas Barrett and Derek Smallhorn, were captured and then brutally murdered in revenge by an SLA militiaman. Then the final institutional failure of that era came at Qana in 1996. During an Israeli military operation, hundreds of Lebanese civilians, trusting the Blue Helmets, sought refuge inside a clearly marked UN compound. Despite its international protection, the compound was deliberately shelled by Israeli artillery, killing over 100 displaced civilians. The attack proved that the UN was entirely incapable of deterring or defending against aggression from a powerful state actor. In Angola, the United Nations' failure was a disastrous combination of under-resourcing and a fundamental lack of political courage to enforce the peace it was mandated to keep. After decades of brutal civil war, the UN Angola Verification Mission 2 was deployed in 1991 to monitor a peace accord, supervise disarmament, and oversee the country's first democratic elections in 1992. The mission was built on the naive assumption that the MPLA government and the UNITA rebels were committed to ending the conflict. This assumption led to the mission being crippled by severe resource limitations and an excessively narrow mandate. UNAVEM II was deployed with only about 350 unarmed military observers, along with 126 police observers across an entire country. An insufficient force that entirely lacked the power to enforce compliance with disarmament agreements. Both warring parties exploited this weakness, failing to demobilize their forces and maintaining secret armies in blatant violation of the peace accords. The collapse came after the September 1992 elections, when the rebel group UNITA rejected the results and immediately plunged the country back into civil war. The under-resourced UN mission retreated into a position of diplomatic silence. The UN forces in Angola were heavily criticized for adopting a dangerous see-no-evil posture, often refusing to call out UNITA's violations and warmongering. This paralysis was meant to prioritize maintaining neutrality and avoiding confrontation over upholding the integrity of the peace process. But it only resulted in the start of the deadliest phase of the war, with an estimated 300,000 people killed in the next 2 years. Even when the mission was finally scaled up and given more resources in 1995, the country had lost all faith in the organization's will to act, viewing the Blue Helmets as passive bystanders. The disaster in Somalia is the textbook example of mission creep. A humanitarian effort violently transformed into an ill-conceived attempt at nation-building with catastrophic consequences for the UN and its primary military contributor, the United States. The mission, UNOSOM II, took over in 1993 after an initial US-led intervention had secured aid delivery. The UN ambitiously expanded its mandate from feeding the starving to an aggressive, complex Chapter 7 role of disarming militias, enforcing peace, and establishing a democratic government. This was an expansion that drastically overmatched the UN's organizational capability. The greatest flaw was the complete lack of unified command and control. UNOSOM II was a massive multinational effort, yet different national contingents operated under inconsistent rules of engagement and distinct chains of command. The Turkish force commander nominally oversaw the mission, but US officers wielded disproportionate authority and often reported through separate American channels. This meant that strategic decisions at the very top were never truly synchronized. The flashpoint came in June 1993. Following an ambush that killed 24 Pakistani peacekeepers inspecting a Somali radio station, the UN leadership decided to escalate. Instead of adjusting tactics, they issued a warrant for the arrest of warlord General Mohammed Farah Adid, effectively turning a peacekeeping operation into a manhunt, making the UN a direct combatant against a powerful local faction and transforming the mission's focus from saving lives to taking them. This disastrous escalation culminated in the infamous Black Hawk Down battle on October 3rd to 4th of 1993. When US forces launched quick raids to capture Adid's lieutenants, the mission went completely wrong. 2 US helicopters were shot down, and in the subsequent overnight battle, the chaos of command became brutally clear. Rescue convoys and quick reaction forces from other UN nations, like Pakistan and Malaysia, weren't effectively integrated into the US-led recovery plan, resulting in delays, confusion, and further casualties. Ultimately, 18 US soldiers and a Malaysian peacekeeper died. The sight of dead American troops being dragged through the streets led to immediate public outcry and the collapse of international political will. The failure immediately created the Somalia syndrome, a crippling fear of intervention that would haunt the UN just months later in a distant African nation facing true annihilation. The Rwandan genocide stands as the United Nations' most profound moral and institutional failure, shattering the promise of never again made after the Holocaust and proving that a lack of political will can be as deadly as any weapon. The small United Nations assistance mission for Rwanda, led by the tragically prescient Canadian Major General Romeo Dallaire, was deployed in late 1993 with a weak Chapter 6 mandate, meaning they were there to monitor a fragile peace accord, not to fight or enforce it. In January 1994, Dallaire received explosive insider intelligence from a top-level informant who explicitly warned of a plot to slaughter Tutsis. The informant chillingly stated that the armed Hutu Interahamwe militias were being trained and armed, and that they could kill up to 1,000 Tutsis in 20 minutes. Dallaire immediately sent the notorious genocide fax to UN headquarters in New York, urgently requesting permission to conduct preemptive raids on the arms caches. The response from the UN Department of Peacekeeping Operations? Well, they flatly forbade any proactive action, instructing Dallaire to strictly stick to his limited, non-interventionist mandate. Dallaire was effectively ordered to stand down, a decision driven by a crippling fear of mission creep and political reluctance, especially from the United States and other powers, to become entangled in another costly African war immediately following the Somalia disaster. The UN command prioritized diplomatic risk aversion over the explicit danger to a civilian population. When the violence exploded in April of 1994, the peacekeepers were neither reinforced nor authorized to intervene to stop the mass killings. Instead, in a devastating display of Security Council abandonment, after 10 Belgian peacekeepers were murdered, the international response was to drastically reduce the mission from 2,500 personnel to a symbolic remnant of around 270. The world effectively voted to evacuate and abandon the people of Rwanda at the exact moment the genocide was accelerating. Dallaire and his remaining blue helmets, operating under crippling orders, were forced to watch as an estimated 800,000 people were murdered over 100 days. A later UN inquiry admitted that the lack of political will and restrictive orders had crippled UNAMIR. The political indifference demonstrated in Rwanda stands as a moral stain on the organization, but the shame didn't end there. Just a year later, that same hesitation would allow another genocide to occur under the UN's very nose, this time in Europe. The United Nations Protection Force in Bosnia was arguably the most politically and militarily compromised mission of the mid-1990s, defined by its crippling ambiguity over whether it was there to keep peace or enforce it. This systemic failure was laid bare in two devastating incidents in 1995 that together ensured the mission's final tragic failure. The first disaster struck in May 1995. After NATO, acting on the UN's behalf, launched airstrikes to deter Bosnian Serb aggression, the Bosnian Serbs retaliated swiftly by seizing approximately 350 UN peacekeepers from various contingents. These blue helmets were cynically chained to strategic military targets like ammunition depots and bridges as living human shields. This humiliating scenario, broadcast globally, immediately paralyzed the international deterrent. The UN Command and the Security Council responded by suspending NATO air operations for weeks to secure the release of the hostages. This failure of deterrence set the stage for the moral catastrophe that followed. In July 1995, Bosnian Serb forces, led by General Ratko Mladic, launched a decisive offensive against Srebrenica, one of the UN-declared safe areas. The defense of the enclave rested entirely on lightly armed Dutch peacekeepers, whose ultimate deterrent, NATO air support, was shackled by a cumbersome political dual-key system requiring agonizingly slow approval from UN civilian command. As the Serbs advanced, Dutch commanders frantically requested the promised airstrikes. In the most egregious moment of hesitation, UN civilian chief Yasushi Akashi actually called off airstrikes after only a brief sortie, yielding to Serb threats against UN personnel. By the time limited airstrikes were finally authorized, it was too late. The peacekeepers, ordered not to aggressively resist, were forced to stand by, and in some cases were coerced into facilitating the Bosnian Serbs as they separated the men and boys. Over the next few days, more than 8,000 Bosniak men and boys were systematically executed. The sheer horror of the event forced the organization to adopt the Brahimi Report reforms, demanding that future mandates be explicitly robust. In 1999, the United Nations mission in East Timor was established to organize a referendum on independence from Indonesia. The overwhelming global desire to achieve this political goal resulted in a catastrophic security compromise. The UN accepted that Indonesia would retain sole responsibility for security during the consultation process. This was a perverse and fatal arrangement, as the Indonesian military was actively hostile to independence and known to arm, fund, and control the brutal local pro-integration militia gangs. The small UN mission itself was composed only of unarmed police and observers, effectively relying on a hostile party to keep the peace. When the East Timorese people voted overwhelmingly for independence, the results immediately triggered a calculated scorched earth campaign of revenge by the militias and rogue elements of the Indonesian army. They murdered independent supporters, burned towns, and launched direct attacks on UN local staff. With no UN troops authorized to protect them, UN compounds became besieged sanctuaries, and the mission leadership was forced into a desperate retreat, relocating almost all international and non-essential staff. The rampage killed over 1,400 people and displaced 2/3 of the population. It took 2 agonizing weeks of intense international pressure, severe diplomatic measures, and political maneuvering before the UN Security Council finally authorized a robust multinational force, led by Australia, to deploy under Chapter 7 and halt the violence. Just as the UN was trying to clean up the security disaster in East Timor, the organization was blindsided by a massive breakdown of its mission in Sierra Leone. The UN mission in Sierra Leone was tasked with overseeing a peace deal, including the critical disarmament of the brutal Revolutionary United Front, or the RUF. However, the deployment was painfully slow, logistically poor, and geographically thin, leaving peacekeepers spread out and isolated across the country. The RUF leadership quickly realized the UN's weakness, and in May of 2000, they deliberately defied the peace agreement and turned on the UN forces, launching coordinated strikes that killed several peacekeepers and, in a matter of days, took over 500 UN personnel hostage. Many of the captured blue helmets, primarily from African and Asian contingents, were disarmed at gunpoint. Their weapons and armored vehicles stolen by the RUF and used against government forces. The UN's mandate in Sierra Leone, which authorized the use of force to protect civilians and disarm rebels, was far beyond the actual capabilities, training, and equipment of the contingents initially on hand. Political and budgetary delays meant that promised heavy equipment, crucial transport, and specialized helicopters hadn't arrived by the time the RUF attacked. The UN leadership on the ground was further crippled by poor communication and unclear authority to fight back decisively against the non-state actors. The mission was only saved by swift external intervention. British forces, sent initially for a non-UN evacuation operation, and Guinean reinforcements had to intervene directly to stabilize the collapsing security situation and rescue many of the captured peacekeepers. A subsequent UN inquiry confirmed that the mission's failure was due to the discrepancy between the Security Council's ambitious mandate and the timely provision of robust resources. The crisis in Sierra Leone forced the UN to ask for British aid. 3 years later, in the Democratic Republic of Congo, the organization was forced to ask for an emergency European Union intervention to salvage the collapsing mission. The UN mission in the DR Congo was tasked with monitoring the sprawling, resource-rich nation after the end of the Second Congo War. However, the mission started with fewer than 100 military observers, a laughably inadequate number for a country the size of Western Europe. This fundamental failure in resource allocation meant that when regional dynamics changed, the mission was instantly overwhelmed. The disaster struck the town of Bunia in the volatile Ituri district in 2003. When Ugandan forces withdrew from the area, a massive security void was instantly created. Fighting exploded, leading to a humanitarian catastrophe marked by horrific violence, including massacres and cannibalism. The local UN presence was wholly incapable of extending its authority beyond its perimeter. The peacekeepers could do little but retreat to the airport and their bases, where they successfully sheltered thousands of terrified civilians who had nowhere else to run. But while the UN base became a crowded sanctuary, the peacekeepers were forced to be passive witnesses to the massacres raging just a few hundred meters away in the town center. The situation was on the brink of total failure, threatening to compromise the entire UN effort in the DRC. Faced with this embarrassing and deadly paralysis, UN Secretary General Kofi Annan made an unprecedented plea to the European Union. The EU responded by launching Operation Artemis, a French-led, rapidly deployed and robust multinational force under Chapter 7. This emergency intervention secured Bunia in a matter of weeks, demonstrating what the UN force should have been all along. If the UN mission in the DRC was crippled by political caution, the mission in Darfur was outright sabotaged by a hostile host government and a chronic failure of member states to deliver promised resources. The African Union UN hybrid mission in Darfur was conceived in 2007 to quell violence and protect civilians amidst what the US termed as a genocide. However, the mission was immediately overwhelmed by both logistical shortfalls and political interference from the Sudanese government. From the start, The UN operated without the teeth it desperately needed in Darfur's vast and hostile terrain. Despite urgent, repeated appeals, the force had 0 attack helicopters for years and consistently received far fewer transport helicopters than were promised. This crucial lack of air mobility and air cover crippled UNAMID's ability to patrol, respond to attacks quickly, or conduct medical evacuations. In one incident in 2007, the UN base at Haskanita was overrun by rebel forces, killing 10 peacekeepers. Beyond being under-resourced, the UN force was deliberately undermined and muzzled by the Sudanese government, which imposed severe restrictions on the movement of UN personnel and equipment. Furthermore, internal documents suggested that UN officials intentionally withheld or manipulated reports detailing the Sudanese government's indiscriminate bombing of civilians and atrocities committed by government-backed militias, all to avoid political fallout or antagonizing Khartoum. This severely eroded the mission's credibility and betrayed the victims it was meant to help. Darfur became a painful example of how a peacekeeping operation can be rendered entirely impotent by a toxic combination of member state neglect in providing key military assets and host state obstruction that is quietly tolerated by the Security Council. The UN mission in Ethiopia and Eritrea provides a clear, chilling example of a peacekeeping mission being defeated by a methodical, insidious logistical campaign orchestrated by the host country. The UN was deployed in 2000 after the border war, successfully establishing a buffer zone known as the Temporary Security Zone. However, as the final border demarcation process stalled, largely due to Ethiopia's refusal to accept a binding ruling, Eritrea grew increasingly frustrated. Eritrea saw the peacekeeping mission as complicit in maintaining an unacceptable status quo and, in clear violation of the Status of Forces Agreement, decided to choke it out. The initial act came in 2007 when Eritrea first banned UN helicopter flights, and then Eritrea unilaterally cut off all fuel supplies to the mission's entire Eritrean sector. Without fuel, UN convoys were grounded, peacekeepers couldn't patrol the buffer zone, generators couldn't run to provide basic power or heat, and supplies couldn't be refrigerated. The force was effectively immobilized and the safety of the troops was critically compromised, with reports that some contingents lacked fuel even to retrieve fresh water. The UN appealed repeatedly to the Security Council, but the major powers were divided, disinterested, and slow to act, revealing a profound lack of political will to confront Eritrea diplomatically or logistically. By early 2008, the mission was strategically untenable. In February, the UN was forced to order a withdrawal from Eritrea for the safety of its personnel. Eritrean forces even tried to impede the withdrawal, attempting to seize UN equipment as the peacekeepers left. The UN Security Council terminated its mandate in July 2008, leaving the border unmonitored and tense. The UN Interim Security Force for Abyei was deployed to the tense, oil-rich border region disputed between Sudan and newly independent South Sudan. The force was entirely composed of Ethiopian troops, intended to be a neutral buffer. In August 2011, a UNFICYP patrol vehicle hit a landmine with 1 Ethiopian peacekeeper killed and 3 others gravely injured and bleeding out. The UN immediately scrambled a medevac helicopter, an action that, under the Status of Forces agreements with Sudan, should not require prior authorization in a medical emergency. However, Sudanese armed forces controlling the area blatantly violated the agreement. They refused flight clearance and threatened to shoot the UN helicopter down if it took off without their express permission. For over 3 agonizing hours, UN officials frantically negotiated with the Sudanese military, while the severely wounded peacekeepers lay in critical condition. By the time the clearance was finally granted, it was too late. All 3 injured peacekeepers subsequently died from their wounds. UN officials later admitted that with prompt evacuation, their lives could likely have been saved. The UN Organization Stabilization Mission in the DRC was, and remains, one of the UN's largest and most expensive operations, with close to 19,000 uniformed personnel. It was tasked, under Chapter 7, with protecting civilians and supporting the Congolese state. However, when the M23 rebel group launched a major offensive on the eastern capital of Goma in November 2012, the UN was rendered entirely inert by a critical design gap in its mandate execution. The mandate legally required the UN to operate in support of the host nation's army, the FRADC. When the FRADC suddenly collapsed and fled the city, the UN force was left in a policy vacuum. Although the UN possessed attack helicopters and was vastly better armed than the M23 rebels, its commanders refused to engage unilaterally, feeling it wasn't up to us to fight directly without the national army taking the lead. The result was UN peacekeepers literally watching as M23 rebels marched into the city of 1 million people. At one point, 2 UN armored trucks were even seen retreating in front of the advancing rebels. The city fell without resistance, leading France's UN ambassador to call the passivity absurd. Thousands of civilians who had sought protection from the UN were abandoned, their faith in the blue helmet shattered. This embarrassment finally spurred the Security Council to break an old peacekeeping taboo. The next year, the UN created the Force Intervention Brigade, given a unique, offensive mandate to unilaterally neutralize armed groups. For years, the UN mission in Mali held the grim title of the deadliest UN mission, with over 170 peacekeepers killed by hostile acts, most of them victims of improvised explosive devices and ambushes. The mission was structurally handicapped from its inception in 2013. While the mandate was designed to stabilize the massive territory and protect civilians against jihadist groups, the force initially consisted mostly of infantry from developing nations who lacked critical modern equipment. The contrast with specialized Western contingents was stark. The vast majority of troops were deploying without essential ISR equipment, sufficient transport, or night vision capability. This meant that peacekeepers were constantly exposed to lethal, low-tech attacks, meaning that routine patrols and resupply convoys were high-risk operations. While the French counter-terrorism operation initially provided some emergency air support, this was unreliable and later withdrawn, leaving UN camps even more vulnerable. The mission was further constrained by the host government itself. After the 2020 and 2021 military coups, the Malian authorities increasingly restricted the UN's use of air assets, including key intelligence-gathering drones. The result was a mission where up to 80% of its resources were devoted merely to self-sustainment and defense, rather than executing its mandate to protect civilians. The UN Disengagement Observer Force was a decades-old monitoring mission on the ceasefire line between Syria and Israel. It was a traditional Chapter 6 mission, entirely unprepared for the savage spillover of the Syrian civil war. In August 2014, Al-Qaeda-affiliated Al-Nusra Front militants overran a key border crossing, immediately seizing 45 Fijian peacekeepers and detaining them after the Fijians surrendered their weapons. The militants then surrounded 2 nearby UN outposts held by 72 Filipino peacekeepers, demanding they too surrender their arms in exchange for the Fijian safety. The UN force commander, seeking to ensure the immediate release of the Fijian hostages, reportedly ordered the Filipino contingent to comply and surrender their weapons. This order was instantly and defiantly rejected by the Filipino military command in Manila. The Philippine military chief directly advised his troops to defy the order and hold their ground, famously stating, "We will not allow our soldiers to become sacrificial pawns." The standoff escalated into a ferocious 7-hour gun battle as over 100 militants assaulted the Filipino outpost with mortar fire and armed trucks. The Filipino troops, acting under orders from their own capital and against the wishes of the immediate UN command, fought back fiercely. Critically, during the firefight, Syrian government forces provided indirect artillery support to suppress the rebel attack, and prevent the UN post from being completely overrun. In the end, the Filipino troops, with assistance from Irish peacekeepers and the indirect Syrian fire, successfully fought out and executed a daring escape under the cover of darkness, retaining their weapons and suffering 0 casualties. The Fijians, having complied with the initial order to surrender, remained hostages for weeks. The UN mission in South Sudan, established to support the fragile independence, housed over 200,000 internally displaced persons in special protection of civilian sites attached to its bases. These sites, created out of necessity, were places of last resort. In February 2016, violence erupted within the Malakal POC site, which housed multiple ethnic groups. The internal fighting quickly spiraled out of control and morphed into a full-scale assault on the compound, largely facilitated by South Sudanese government soldiers and affiliated militias who breached the perimeter fence. The UN force, despite operating under a robust Chapter 7 mandate to protect civilians from imminent threat, was crippled by indecision. A subsequent UN headquarters board of inquiry found that the mission failed to manage the crisis effectively. Conflicting interpretations of the rules of engagement among different national units meant that commanders refused to act decisively. Some peacekeepers reportedly abandoned their post, allowing attackers, some wearing South Sudanese army uniforms, to enter the camp. Furthermore, some units reportedly requested written confirmation before using lethal force, while others were criticized for firing warning shots that drove panicked civilians back into the danger zone. The intervention was delayed for more than 12 hours as the internal fighting and external attack raged. At least 30 people were killed and parts of the camp burned to the ground. A report by Médecins Sans Frontières later found that the UN had failed to act in a timely manner and even blocked civilians from reaching safety during the emergency. The catastrophe at Malakal led to the replacement of the force commander and underscored the urgent need for absolute clarity in ROE and rigorous training to ensure peacekeepers never substitute political convenience for the mandate to protect human life. In July 2016, the capital, Juba, erupted in intense fighting between government and opposition forces. The primary UN headquarters at UN House, which included a massive POC site, came under sustained, indiscriminate artillery fire, killing numerous civilians sheltering there. The ensuing independent special investigation delivered a scathing verdict. It found that UN forces suffered from an overall lack of leadership, preparedness, and integration, and that troops maintained an inexcusable risk-averse posture. This paralysis was called out on 2 fronts. First, the investigation documented the mission's failure to protect people outside its base. At the nearby Terrain Hospital compound, where aid workers were being subjected to abuses by government soldiers, UN troops, located just over a kilometer away, failed to send a quick reaction force despite multiple urgent pleas for rescue. Multiple national contingents turned down the requests, citing a lack of commitment or operational capacity. Second, the internal failure tragically cost the lives of peacekeepers themselves. During the intense street battles, 2 Chinese peacekeepers were killed and several wounded. A review found that the deaths were compounded by severe logistical failures. The mission lacked an on-site surgical team and blood supplies, and, critically, hesitated to evacuate the casualties without first securing host government permission. This bureaucratic caution meant precious hours were lost. At least one of the peacekeepers was deemed likely to have died due to this unnecessary delay in treatment. The history of UN peacekeeping is marked by recurring and tragic compromise, exposing a devastating gap between the UN's ideal and its reality on the ground. The failures consistently fall into 3 categories. First is the failure of mandate and will, where missions were repeatedly sent into active conflict zones with weak mandates, which meant troops were often forbidden from acting decisively or delayed by bureaucratic red tape. Second is the failure of resources and command, where missions were chronically under-resourced. The UN asked its peacekeepers to fight asymmetric wars with inadequate logistics. Third is the failure of sovereignty and consent, where the peacekeeping's reliance on host state consent means missions can be summarily shut down or actively sabotaged when the host acts against the peacekeepers. But what do you think? In a world as complex and volatile as we have today, is there a place for UN peacekeepers? Is there a history of failures proof that their concept is flawed and should not be implemented in future conflicts? Let us know all that and more in the comment section below. And as always, guys, thank you so much for watching, and I hope you learned something new.